My name is Kenji Yoshida, and the title of our paper is Articulatory Asymmetry in Consonantal Sequences, a case from English Fukui Japanese and Chaozhou Chinese. The goal is to investigate into a challenge in speech production. Here, production of two types of consonantal sequences. The first, non-nasal plosive plus nasal sequence, as in hidden in English, and Nitta in Fukui Japanese. And the other one is nasal plus plosive sequences, as big in Chaozhou Chinese and Nitta in Korean. We will examine the pattern of articulatory coordination and acoustics. Production of nasal plosive and plosive nasal sequences has been described as articulatory timing shifts in the opposite orders by Lever. When oral closure and V-leak opening are made simultaneously, full nasal is produced. But when oral closure is maintained but V-leak goes from open to close, nasal plus plosive sequence is produced. But when oral closure is maintained but V-leak goes from close to open, then plosive plus nasal is produced. So these two sequences are described as mirror images of each other. So there seems to be symmetry between these two consonantal sequences. So the first target of the study is nasal plosion. As described in Ladefoged and Johnson, oral closure is maintained while velar goes from close to open, and the acoustic is silenced followed by nasal murmur. So this is a case of plosive plus nasal sequence. This has been attested for English and German, but also for Fukui Japanese and Japanese non-theatrical plays. The other target is prenasalized stop. In this case, oral closure is maintained while velar goes from open to close. So the acoustic is nasal murmur followed by silence or voicing. So this is a case of nasal plus plosive sequence. There are many attested cases of this, many of which arise through denasalization of full nasal consonants. Let's look at the acoustic property of nasal plosion first. This shows a case of hidden in English
Hidden.
and Nitta in Fukui Japanese.
Nitta.
And in both cases, we see interval of closure for D and T and nasal murmur. But for prenasalized stop case, this is a case for the word meaning letter in Chaozhou Chinese. Nasal murmur is followed by the interval of voice vowel alone. So we see largely the same events in the opposite order. Importantly, we found individual and lexical variation in Chaozhou Chinese. Speaker 1 produces all these words with denasalized nasal. So we are sorry that the left column of figure 4 needs correction. But speaker 2 produces many of these words with denasalized nasal, but only 2 words with full nasal. So for this speaker, we obtained 2 minimal pairs, which we will rely on later. Now, in order to observe articulatory processes, we took real-time MRI. Each of the sessions lasts 30 seconds. Within this, a speaker produces the same utterances repeatedly as I said bitten, not bidding, I said bitten, not bidding, by doing this, we obtain 300 frames of MRI image from each of the sessions. On these images, we manually traced the relevant articulators and made measurements. For oral gesture articulations, for Chaozhou Chinese, we measured the distance between lips. For English and Fukui speakers, we measure the distance between tongue tip and the palate. And also for V-lick articulations, we measured minimum distance between velum and real pharyngeal wall. One problem is that the time resolution of the MRI can be insufficient for rapid movements of the articulators. But we believe that it is safe to assume that the frames in the repetitions randomly scatter around the timing of interest. In this hypothetical case, the mean of the 7 repetitions gives the estimate of 0.61 as opposed to the real aperture of 1.0. This gives us suboptimal but meaningful estimates, which allows us some meaningful comparison between conditions. Now, let's look at the result. First, nasal plosion of English. Please remember that what we are looking at is mean aperture of the time-aligned frames. The horizontal axis shows the time, in this case frames, and the vertical axis shows the aperture, degree of opening. In this case, at the frame 3, both tongue tip and velum are closed, but at the following 2 frames, 4 and 5, while tongue tip closure is maintained, velum is opened. This confirms impressionistic descriptions. And turning into Fukui Japanese, we basically see the similar or same result. Again, at the frame 3, tongue tip and velum are closed, and at the following 2 frames, 4 and 5, while tongue tip is closed and velum is opened. Please look at the result from another speaker of Fukui Japanese. Again, at the frame 3, both tongue tip and velum is closed, and the following 2 frames, only velum is opened. So, the results are consistent across English and Fukui Japanese. Now, let's move on to the result from Chaozhou Chinese. This panel shows the result for full nasal stop. Okay. At the frame 3 and 6, labial closure is maintained. On the other hand, velum is wide open throughout the frame 2 to 6 for 2 nasal stops, M and Igma. Now, let's move on to the case result from prenasalized stop. In this case, again, labial closure is achieved at the frame 2 and 6. At the frame 2, velum is opened, but the aperture is 0.7 on average, which is much smaller than the nasal plosion case. But we are sorry that the text is incorrect here. The max 0.1 was wrong. The 0.7 is correct. Okay, please look at the result from another speaker, which was not shown in the paper. The result is basically the same. At the frame 2 and 3 and frame 7, labial closure is achieved. And at the frame 2, velum is opened, but the aperture is 0.6, which is much smaller than the nasal plosion case. Okay, now let's summarize. and go back to our research question. Our question was whether nasal plosive and plosive plus nasal sequences are mirror images of each other. And now let's summarize the result. We would like to use a gestural overlap account by Brauman Goldstein. While when V-leak opening and oral closure are made simultaneously, full nasal is produced. And when these gestures are shifted in time, prenasalized stop is produced. That's the model. And when these articulators, V-leak opening and oral closure, are shifted in time in the opposite way, then the nasal plosion is produced. But the result we observed in our study is that V-leak opening is much larger for nasal plosion case and much smaller and briefer for prenasalized stop case. To sum up, we made comparison of plosive plus nasal and nasal plus plosive consonantal sequences. The result shows that the V-leak opening is much smaller and briefer for plosive plus nasal sequences. So they are not the mirror images of each other. So we found articulatory asymmetry. This is another case demonstrating that speech production can be conditioned by the metrical status of the speech segments. In the present case, plosive plus nasal sequence, such as in hidden and Nitta, was achieved by vowel syncope from hidden and mitenta. So N here is syllabic nasal. And on the other hand, for nasal plus plosive case, denasalized stop is a syllable onset arising from denasalization. So they are drastically different in their metrical status. And now we would like to thank to these institutions and persons for participation and assistance, advice, and funding. Thank you very much.